Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being with us today. Today, we will be talking about basic concepts for the prevention of substance abuse in Latino communities and Hispanic communities. We can go on to the next slide. Before we begin, I would like to say that we are the Hispanic Latino Behavioral Health Center of Excellence, and our mission is to promote and support the sustainability of behavioral health through the promotion of prevention, intervention, multiple recovery pathways, and community-driven, culturally embedded, person-centered recovery supports for Hispanic and Latino communities. Our effort is to achieve this mission through the development and the diffusion of information for behavioral health through intervention and various avenues of recuperation and the supports for recovery impulsed by a community that is culturally arranged and centered on people for the Hispanic and Latino communities. We are very happy with the collaboration that we have today with the Ohio Center of Excellence for Behavioral Health Prevention and Promotion, the Ohio Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services, and the Great Lake Prevention Technology Transfer Center Network. Without them, this workshop would not have been possible. Next slide. And now I will share some brief but important notes. Today's event is being recorded. All the participants will be in silence and the cameras will be off, even though you can raise your hands to be able to, if you want to be allowed to talk, so you can ask your question directly. Make sure that your speakers are on and at a high volume so you can hear the presentation. If you have any technical difficulties, please send us a message to the Hispanic Latino Behavioral Health COE at the chat. And if you have any question for the presenters, in this case, Christina, we ask you to use the question and answer tab or write the question directly on the chat. Next slide. Once we've finished this event, we ask you to please complete our evaluation. We will have 2 evaluations this time, even though we acknowledge that this can be a little tedious. We ask you to fill out both since they are important for the participation certificate, as also for those who want to get the continued education credits. So we will share a link through the chat. It will be cataloged by number, and you can also scan the QR code at the end of the presentation to fill these out. You will receive a certificate of attendance through the email in approximately 1 week from today, and we will also share a copy of today's presentation in PDF format through the chat. Our resource today is Cristina Lopez. Thank you for being here with us and talking about such an important subject. And so I will leave you with Cristina so she can introduce herself and start the workshop. Thank you. Thank you to everyone who is here today. Good morning. I'm looking here to see who's with us in the chat. For some of you, it's still early in the morning or late in the afternoon. My name is Cristina Lopez Gutierrez. I am in New Mexico, in the south of New Mexico, and it's warm here. And I can see that you're in different states, so maybe it's not as warm as here, but that's our climate here. I am about 20 miles from El Paso, Texas, and I coincide with Ciudad de Juarez. I've been in the prevention field almost 20 years. I've started almost immediately after high school, starting as a volunteer. And basically, I grew up in prevention. Before the evidence-based programs, before the model-based programs, before all the language that we now know and use when it comes to prevention. We're going to share our objectives today so that we can have some realistic expectations about what we will be talking about today. Our goals for this workshop are: we are going to explain the fundamental principles. I'm sorry, let me turn off here. Okay, we are going to explain the fundamental principles and the terminology of prevention of the problematic use of substances. We will explore the diverse definitions of health and well-being within the Latina Hispanic communities, acknowledging the challenges that those communities might face. We will identify current opportunities and potential opportunities to implement prevention strategies within our professional roles as participants, and we will incorporate the values and strengths, the cultural strengths that are key within the Hispanic Latino communities in initiatives of prevention using best practices. What does all of this mean? Depends on how much time you've been in prevention. We'll give you a taste of prevention. We won't do something too in depth. Our colleagues might be able to tell us the more in-depth workshops that exist for other resources. But today we'll just kind of highlight what the theory is, how our work is done, and see it from a practical perspective. Because this work generally, when I work with programs, my role now is as a workshop leader or support the programs within the communities with evaluations. And what I observe is generally it takes about a year to really understand this work because there's so many facets to it and so many things that we do in prevention. And so simply explaining what prevention is can sometimes be complicated because what do you do? Or you work in the community, or you do coalition work, or what exactly is it that you do? So we're going to look at all of those facets of the prevention work. To continue with the introduction a little more, if you can tell us through the chat how much time you've been working in prevention or specifically in the role that you are now. Maybe some of you have had various roles in this prevention field, and maybe this is your first, or maybe this is your first time in the prevention field. But I'm going to give you a few seconds to, if you could participate in the chat, how long have you been working within the prevention field? 7 months, 47 years, 26 years, a week. Welcome to prevention. Wow. Thank you for sharing. We definitely have some people who, similar to myself, have been in this prevention field and learning from all the theories. Imagine there was a time for those of us who started 20 years ago when we didn't talk about evaluation or some of the things that we will be touching upon today. It's okay that if you don't work directly in prevention. Beatriz, thank you for sharing. We will definitely have a conversation about how our colleagues who are a part of our community can be a part of our work and who currently have to be a part of our work. And so with this, we will, we're going to start focus a little bit more on the workshop. Why Latinos in the United States? This looks very different in their communities. It depends on the focus of your work. Depending on that, the numbers will vary in terms of this population. But the important thing is that this population already has a significance. Again, in some of our communities, much more than in other communities. Maybe in other communities that are still growing, and this population is still growing there. But this is a population that is important in our community. So let's define first. A Hispanic or Latina person refers to someone who is from, their origin is Cuban, Mexican, Puerto Rican, South American, or Central American, or that has a Spanish origin. That is what we are seeing in the definition officially, like how the census defines it. And that is that's where we see some of these numbers from the census. Our next highlight, 63.6 millions of Hispano or Latinos, or more or less 20% already lives in the United States. The census says that they are concentrated in certain areas in Puerto Rico, and it's been a long time since I visited there, but Puerto Rico, New Mexico, here in the state where I live, we have seen that in some of the communities, this is the focal community. California, Texas, Arizona. I think there are some people from Arizona here with us today in the workshop. Nevada, Florida, Colorado, New Jersey, and New York. And again, maybe this is a little bit obvious in your communities. I have to say that these populations, maybe the numbers, those of us who work in these communities, maybe we know that maybe this population is not necessarily, how do you say it? The hidden population, that instead, through any dynamic that exists, be it migration or reading or access or other factors, maybe some of these numbers in some of your communities are higher because maybe the data has not captured that yet. And so again, here I want to highlight that this population is one that is growing in our communities. And some of you might have already seen that. The other thing to highlight is when it comes to this community and the use of substances and mental health is that the different factors that exist in our communities, again, I mentioned the access, that means transportation, language, maybe the providers are not prepared or don't have that connection with our Latino population. And so then some of these numbers are what we are observing. And if you notice, unfortunately, with the exception of grave mental health issues, most of these numbers are reaching about half or went over 50% in terms of the use of substances and mental health in this population.
The
For
use
example,
of substance, 83.3%. I'm going to jump a little bit. The disorder of depression is 49.1%, which is almost a half. And I want to emphasize the access are not really, these are not documented really properly. Maybe these numbers are actually higher in our communities. The importance, why is it important to work with this population, Latin population? It is because definitely if we don't do prevention, these consequences, type of disorders, give me a second. Let's start explaining a little bit what our work in prevention is. We're going to give emphasis on what we're going to practice today, which is prevention of substance abuse. And some of these concepts may be, if you're working in other areas that are not related to the substance abuse, It would apply, but we're only going to use the perspective, the point of view of prevention in this field per se. And the examples that we're going to practice today and the questions and the theories are going to be closely linked to this point of view of prevention. The activities, we're going to go with the explanation or definition. The prevention activities have as an objective to educate and support the people and community to prevent the use and the problematic use of drugs, as well as the mental disorders that these lead to. This also refers to the programs and the policies that are designed to avoid the initial or to reduce the harm reduction of the problems that develop as a consequence of the use of these substances. And I want to pause now for the fellow workers that have joined in the prevention field. You have, some of you mentioned you've only been with us for in this field for months. There was a guy that was only a week. And the point is that our field, our prevention field, there's some terminology that you're going to see for the first time during this webinar. And they're used in the prevention field, and you will see them as a different alphabet, as a different set of keywords, different abbreviations that we have. And I suggest that the people that are new to the field of prevention, they should have their dictionary set aside. The prevention dictionary should be different from the normal dictionary, because this language is one that we're going to be using over and over in this field. And one of the things that I want to make clear is that in prevention, programs and policies are the things what we're targeting, not just design itself, but also what it is implemented per se of these programs and policies. Those of you entering this field recently and who are engaging or doing workshops with fellow colleagues who are just entering the field should develop their own prevention dictionary. And these are the words that I'm going to use. And these are good. The words that I'm using are specific because we got to understand the concepts and the language. And because we're going to be weaving concepts together, we don't want to lose these details. We don't want to lose any of these details in our field. So as we arrive at what our work actually consists of, this is prevention work. These are programs and policies. These are environmental prevention strategies, which are key. We focus on changing the environment, the surroundings, and normally this prevention work, this environmental prevention work, takes time, but the results will be felt in the long term. We seek to change the behavior of people and to develop healthier generations. I'm going to make a pause here, brief pause, to read some of the chat commentaries. How many of you remember, especially those who have been in this field for longer, who remembers when you went to a restaurant and they would ask you, do you want smoking or non-smoking section? You can raise your hand or you can say so in the chats. You go to a restaurant and they would ask you, do you want the smoking or non-smoking section? And if you go farther back, if let's do a review over time, maybe how many of you remember when teachers used to smoke in the lobby, also during the lunch hour in school? they would smoke, these teachers? How many of you remember, for example, the seatbelts? I remember when I was a young girl, seatbelts were not a thing. Even in my family, we had a truck and a pickup truck, and we would climb up into the back on the flatbed, and the more people fit in, the best. And in the back seat, the seat belts would cover more than one person because we were just so young and small. I'm going to take a pause here to read over the chat. I see. Paula, if I'm not catching something, let me know. And Mariluz, I remember when they would make that question. Yeah? Okay. Oh, like a clown car, like a, yeah. You know, the more can fit inside the truck, the best. They would be everybody on top of each other because we're going to go to the stores and everybody needs to go. And a lot of people would fit. And the seatbelt was not something that was used really regularly. Let me see. Let me see. Yeah, yeah. And one more commentary. All right. Some of you, maybe these examples are not registering, you don't remember, they didn't happen to you or for you, or it's not something that you experienced in your communities. And even though those examples, not all of them, even though those examples are linked to prevention, that's the point that I'm trying to make. Those changes, those environmental changes that we make during prevention, we're creating new, healthier generations that are no longer asking these questions. And maybe the new generations are, what? You could smoke in a restaurant? How is that possible? And that case study of having something linked to public health are no longer maybe part of the environment and no longer valid in this new generation. About the concepts of prevention, I'm going to share some things here. Let's return to the strategies that we have in prevention in our communities. We already have policies and practices that go beyond just the non-smoking. With so many options for vaping, there are some policies that address this and they don't allow vaping or smoking, whether it's tobacco or vaping or maybe cannabis in some states. Cannabis that is not allowed in some states. And if we return to the seatbelt example, you can see here in the lower left that I know it looked like a clown car full of so many clowns, but everybody would fill into the car to go visit their aunt or something. And the more people fit, the better. When I started to have kids, they didn't let me go. They didn't release me from the hospital until I took a seatbelt class specifically for a baby because it was a newborn. But nowadays, if you go to a baby shower, for example, what I see, the guests bring a car seat for a 2-year-old maybe, or a car seat for a preschool kid, and they're different varieties, different types. So if we link it back to the environmental strategies, it did not happen overnight. These policies and these procedures in our communities did not happen overnight, but they're focused on changing the environment, the surroundings, as it is pointed out in the bullet number 4. The changes are going to be felt on the long term. And the following generations are not going to have that type of question whether I should use a seatbelt or not. But again, this is a comparison that is made in combination. The surroundings, the environment. When we're talking about prevention, people may think about trees and gardens and forests when we talk about it, the environment, but what we're talking about is the surroundings. That's what we mean when we talk about environmental work. And if we explain a little bit more what the environmental work means, this is an illustration that I like to use in the communities, because you can see this little fish. This fish is not healthy. And in this case, maybe this little fish could jump to another healthier place. But in our communities, when we're working in prevention, we can't have these young people that may be experimenting with a substance, or a family that is suffering a substance abuse issue. We can't just place them in a new community. So we go back to the same thing. We have to change the surroundings, the environment. And I'm using this words, surroundings and environment, in the right context. And this is important to change the community, the environment of the community. Depending on where you come from, your backgrounds, they use these type of different words. But my point is that they mean the same thing. We're changing the environment, the context, the communal context where we're working. Again, our prevention dictionary that we are developing right now, let's go into the theory proper. Our second little taste of theories, of prevention theories, and what we do in our field. What we do is we do harm reduction, or risk factors. We reduce the risk factors, which are characteristics that exist in the school, in the community, in the family, or within an individual's context and surroundings. Science has determined, because somebody else has already done the work, that when you increase these risk factors, you also increase the antisocial behaviors, like the use of drugs, violence, delinquency, or school abandonment. If there's other factors that you can explain these with, if there are other risk factors in our communities, they will lead to other behaviors that are not really that healthy and are mostly antisocial.
Work that we do when we're implementing prevention activities, we have to see where we are reducing these risk factors. We have an illustration here, and the references that we have here, there's much more information available to go more in depth into these theories. But this one comes from the social ecological model, which says that these areas are the ones that influence an individual. And it speaks of the importance of us fighting in our work, so to speak. We have to fight within these contexts on an individual level, on a family level, school level, and community level. And why? Because in these environments and in these contexts, because they influence an individual so much, that person is then more liable to have those disorders that we had already mentioned, like violence, substance abuse, or any other behavior that is not healthy. What I want to highlight here as well, in English, there's a saying in our field of work that says that we do We work in multiple contexts, be it individual, the family, the school, or the community, and with multiple strategies. And we're going to be seeing later on how that is the case. Okay, let's do that. I kind of jumped ahead a bit. What I want to highlight as well is in prevention, our work is always in a group setting. We're going to introduce other definitions here, and then we're going to explain it. The populations that we tend to work with are three. The universal, which focus in a whole population. When we do universal prevention work, that means that it is a whole community, a whole school, or a whole neighborhood. Without considering the risk of the problematic use of substances. So we have percentages from the census, maybe we have some numbers from a local census from the school, but we are working under the impression that if we are going to work with our universal population, that in this school, for particularly, we're going to focus on that because maybe there is a census there or a study on a state or local level or some data that we have which says that that school is one of the ones that we have to pay attention to. Maybe the environment where it is, where it exists, or risk factors that exist. And so let's say that that school, simply because of its location, we will be focusing on universal prevention there. That's an example. Then selective prevention is focused on groups of people with a higher risk to the average of getting involved in the problematic use of substances. And these, for examples, would be support groups for students with a history of substance abuse in their family. We're going to use the example of the school. So if I'm doing universal prevention, working with with universal groups, I'm working with the school, high school, let's say. With this school, where the local census or a local survey gave us some information that we should keep an eye on the school because maybe the grades on average compared to other schools is low. And so that is my universal work. When I am doing selective work with that same school, there I am looking, I have more data. The data is what is tangible, what guides our work. And so these are tangible data that says maybe in that school, I will focus, if it's a high school, I will focus on the kids from 11th grade. Why? Because I have more data that says that maybe in the 11th grade, all of these students of that grade, because, there's more alert because maybe they have more incidents, they're visiting the principal more. Maybe I have records and archives of their attendance level and that it's worse compared to their peers. So I'm still working in group from universal prevention and to more selective because I have more data. When we go to indicated prevention, it focuses on specific people where we already see an existence of the use of substance within the family, or we see high risk behaviors that might lead to use. But these are not treatment services. We are not counselors, and it's not adequate for people who already have some type of developed substance abuse issue and need a more intense therapy intervention process. So if I am implementing programs or practices at a universal level, first, universal, the whole school, because a survey told me that's the school. We need to keep an eye on that. There's some interesting numbers in relation to the rest of the city. A selective program, and then here, these groups, I'm focused on the group that of the young kids who are in the class or are 11th grade. And those kids that are in 11th grade, I have more data that maybe those kids in 11th grade, I'm working with some classes, some teachers, maybe 2 or 3 of these teachers, because these teachers have the students in their classroom and maybe have more incidents, maybe have been to the principal's office, have been to the counselor, maybe their attendance level, maybe their grades. I have more data to have a practice and do the indicated focus. So all of these examples, as a person who works in prevention and whatever title you have or possess, be it prevention coordinator, coalition coordinator, education coordinator, whatever title you have within our field of prevention, we work with only groups. We are not jumping into a space where we are doing individual prevention with anybody. This is another illustration with the same examples that I have given. So we're still working in groups. We have universal, selective, and indicated. These groups are going to get smaller. As we see in this illustration, the first example I gave you of a universal practice is in the whole school. The selective is those that are in 11th grade. And indicated is that I'm working some kids and the teachers and these kids in these classrooms because they are more, have a higher risk factor, or they have already started experimenting. But their files are telling us that their risk factors in comparison to others is higher. So what happens here is that these are all valid when it comes to prevention: universal, selective, and indicated. That is how we do prevention. The groups get smaller, the size of the group gets smaller, but also the factors increase. So in the examples I just gave you, on a universal level, I'm using a local survey. On selective level, I have more data. I have more data that is telling me that maybe the kids from 11th grade are more at risk, have attendance issues, or are going to see the principal. And then if I'm doing an indicated practice, those are a part of that same school, but now I am selecting this indicated practice because the risk factors of these kids in particular, with certain teachers where we have evidence that these kids are visiting the principal's office, are going to the counselor's office, are not coming to school, et cetera, et cetera. So the risk factors are increasing. So also when we're doing this kind of interventions on a selective, universal, or indicated level, sorry, said them in the wrong order: universal, selective, and indicated. Now, usually we need more personnel. It's more and more resources are needed, so more personnel, and maybe a curriculum that we are choosing for this population is more intense. Maybe on a universal level, my curriculum, I come to the school, maybe I'm having class once a week, but if I'm working with these classes and these teachers on an indicated level, then the groups are smaller, but maybe because the kids are higher risk, maybe I need another colleague to help me in the class. Maybe I'm there every day because I'm there to see how was school. Did you go to class? How's your attitude? Did you visit the principal today? So the data is more intense with this indicated population. I'm going to stop sharing and see what our chat says in relation to when it comes to these indicated or preventive. Let's see, these are the populations we work in. Let me check my chat. What questions do you have about this terminology that I've introduced? Universal, selective, and indicated. I said the definitions in a way that was clear where there's any confusion. This, again, for those of us who are creating our dictionary, our glossary of new words, so to speak, in our prevention field, because it's an intro. When we start looking for the practices and the practices to implement in the communities, this is how we're going to find it. We're going to find it organized in a way for a universal population, for a selective population, or for an indicated population. And so it's important to have these basic terminologies clear, because for those of you who have just becoming integrated to this world, if this is something new, these words are not, you're gonna see these over and over in our field. So let's continue. Here is the theory where all of this comes from. It comes from the model of the Institute of Medicine. The Institute of Medicine model, IOM, is the acronym. And so in our field, we have terms that we have to define and that stay with us in our prevention field. And this is one of them. The important thing here, I'm not going to go too in depth or in detail, but the important thing is that I always see this as like an orange, and we are a part of half of the orange, where we see universal, selective, indicated. This is where it explains that this is where the prevention field exists. This is where this model exists. And these other pieces of the orange, we could say identification of the case, treatment for disorders, long-term treatment and follow-up. These usually in prevention, we don't intervene in that. That is not our role. And generally, our friends, our people in intervention, they need workshops and training and specialized licensing to enter into the field.
I understand also that in some agencies, maybe where you're located right now or currently, maybe you have to provide some of these services because maybe the funds arrived, and in the morning you go to the school and do prevention, and in the afternoon you wear another hat, and maybe you provide some individual services. The point here is that in prevention, really, we don't go into the treatment or the recovery segment of the theory. But if these kids, if we're using the same example of the school, those kids that I'm already working with that have visited the director, have gone to the counselor, that continue to be absent from school, and even besides experimenting with substances, maybe they need other services. Maybe these individuals need other services. And prevention is part of this model, this continuum that will help people become healthier. And this is where our fellow coworkers who are in treatment and in recovery step in and to fulfill the other necessities that these kids could have in the example that I'm talking about. Then we would have to go to these colleagues in treatment and recovery for these services. And this is where coalitions come in. Coalitions are associations composed of different sectors within a community which meet to collaborate to solve community problems. This means that those of us that do prevention or work in prevention and we go to the communities, we're working within a coalition. And now I'm going to give you a very general term. Maybe some of these groups are composed of different sectors or segment, health committees. They're also health councils. They may have other names as well. The point is that we're working within the community along with other groups. With the example that I've been using of the kids in school that may need other prevention needs and requirements, it's key that we work within these coalitions because we can't do all the work ourselves. And returning to these students, maybe some of them need more intense treatment and in the family, because sometimes it happens. It's not just a student, it's that something's going on with their family. That's where these sectors come in and step in, and our colleagues in other fields that are not prevention can step in and help and work within the community. The coalition is the group, the entire group that coordinates all the help they're providing. This illustration that represents a coalition, and you and those of you who represent these coalitions or are working within coalitions like this within the communities, it makes me think of an orchestra conductor, because we want to do prevention and we want to do all kinds of things. But first, we must understand what prevention is, what our mission is within the coalition, what our goals are. And if we have different sectors, maybe they have another point of view, another angle, they come with a school point of view or a business angle. Maybe there's some nurses that come in with the health angle, and all these perspectives or all these point of views and angles are within the same musical page, if you will, using this example. And it's not always easy to always be on the same page, as I say. And I'm going to make a pause here to go back to the chat. How many of you are coordinators within a coalition or a similar group, whether it's a health committee, any other group is doable. The popular term that we use is coalition in our field. That's why we use coalition. How many of you coordinate this type of board or group? Who coordinates this type of coalition? And maybe you can describe or tell us the name of your coalition. Oh, lady, I'm glad you like the illustration. That's how I learned it, and I've been using it ever since. The Community Coalition of, okay. Anybody else? And maybe they're not called coalitions, but maybe it's a different type of committee that you have in your communities. Anybody else wants to share? Well, that's why I mentioned that prevention work is complex, because we are working together. We all want to be on the same page so that we can create beautiful music in our communities. and to have the same angle, the same point of view of prevention and how we're going to face these problems, this can be very challenging indeed. Let's now talk about our colleagues in prevention. I don't remember who, but somebody said they were not in prevention. Now we're going to see how and why it's so important to work with these type of colleagues and fellow coworkers. An introduction to shared risk factors. The previous arrow I mentioned, and I'm condensing because we're only giving you little pieces of this, we're trying to join or eliminate the risk factors in our communities. These are some of the examples in our schools. Implementation or policies of substance abuse in our schools. I, as a prevention coordinator with subsidies and funds, my goal is to reduce the risk of substance use. That's what I have to do. But my coalition also has a police officer, if you will. Because, say, I'm in a rural community and I need to have all these resources, all these colleagues working with me because I can't do it alone. And here comes the police officer, the local police officer. He's a loyal member of the coalition and he's right there with me. But for him, his reduction angle is not necessarily the risk of substance use. For him, it's a matter of reducing legal problems in school. And I also have the counselor at school who's going to talk about academic success. And that's her angle for the counselor in terms of reducing the risk factors. And here, the point is, and let me tell you, we have a lot more resources in our field of prevention work. There are certain risk factors, even though I'm looking at this from the substance use angle, all these angles are linked together. All these points of views are linked together, and these are shared risk factors. This is what we called shared risk factors. That's what we're talking about that's what I'm talking about when I say we're creating music in a music sheet. These are all part of the music sheet. These coalition members are going to link each other. You know, the police is going to be linked to the counselor to the police officer, and to the coordinator. And they're all going to be linked, and they're going to address shared risk factors that are shared among all, if you will. What happens when we do prevention work as a prevention worker, at the time that I write my reports and at the time that I talk to the people that subsidize me, I will communicate certain success with the prevention substance abuse risk. For the officer, for the police officer, they're also going to feel certain successes in reducing the amount or the rate of legal problems among the students. And also the counselor will want to push her goal of raising academic success, increasing academic success. So when we're working within a coalition, we have to have a more of a wider goal than just prevention. And this is what we're talking about when we're working within these coalitions. Now look at this slide. We're asking you to work within a coalition, and if you're within a role of a coordinator and you're working with other colleagues, you have to you have to use well-being as a guiding principle. The state of being happy is healthy and successful and prosperous. Everybody can understand this. Everybody can understand we want a healthier community. Of course, we want a healthier school. So the counselor, the police officer, and the prevention worker can all join under the same goal. And if we're focusing on well-being, on improving the quality of life, or making sure that our youngsters are healthier, that's where we start to establish these links among our work. If you haven't done this, and those of you who are coming into the prevention field, if we go to the school, if we go talk to the counselor because we want to work with these students that I mentioned before. I am Christina, and this is what I do, and I want to come here to change policies because my goal is alcohol and drugs. And the counselor wants to know, how can we work together? How can I connect to this language so that we can work together? And this is what I propose to you. If you're at a point where your coalition has to grow and include more colleagues, then you have to find that commonality, or that you have to find those risk factors that you all want to reduce. And that's where you can all fit in within the same music sheet. And this is a perspective that I'm just presenting to you. Now I'm going to introduce this terminology, but maybe we are not going to be able to go in depth. But I wanted to emphasize that besides the risk factors, there's some people, especially those that work in health clinics or hospitals, and that language links us to those fellow coworkers as well, so that we can use those social determinants, health social determinants, or social determinants of health, if you will. And these are the results that we're seeking in our communities. And I already told you that there's a language associated with risk factor, associated with prevention. And this is another level of risk factors that we have to consider. This is another area of risk factors that we have to consider: where people are born, where they're raised, where they work, where they practice, what religion they are, where they age, the surroundings that people live in. All this can have an effect. Now, in the comments, somebody says that they were working. I saw it very quickly, so sorry if I didn't catch all the details. If somebody is working in a community that is struggling with work, well, let's use COVID as an example. During the pandemic, sometimes we couldn't talk about prevention.
Can't talk about prevention because there's other priorities, like where am I going to work? How am I going to live? How am I taking care of my health? So without those factors, we couldn't talk about prevention and let's reduce the use of alcohol and drugs, because they had other priorities. And so this example of COVID, the thing is we have to notice and work with these factors when we do our work, because maybe we have to look at these factors first before we can start any conversation about use and abuse of substances. So here is another illustration of the social determinants, health determinants. And the only difference you can also, you have the link in your materials. The only thing I'm going to say is that the way that these all link together has to do with where people live, what economic resources do they have, do they feel safe, and all of this will affect the person. And so that's another graphic to try to explain that. We're going to focus a bit on on another aspect of our work, but let me check the chat first. What questions do you have at this point? Anything else? Anything that's not clear? What we have done up to now is we do prevention programs, which are environmental programs. We did them in 3 populations: universal, selective, and indicated. We have to see the risk factors or the health determinants to be able to connect the work with other colleagues in our coalitions, and that's what we have covered so far in our workshop. Anything that's not clear up to this point? Any questions? Okay. And so this would be one of our last subjects before we go into the work regarding our Latino population. At the time of doing our work, we have to notice the fidelity and the adaptation of the work we do. What does that mean? It means that I always use this kind of illustration when it comes to fidelity and adaptation. So, for example, if we are baking a chocolate cake, here we have it, and somebody can say, I'm gluten-free, I can't use regular flour, I have to use almond flour or other types of flour, or I'm allergic to milk or lactose, and so then we can't use that ingredient. Regardless, we can change some ingredients and adapt them, and it will be a chocolate cake. Maybe not with the original ingredients that some of us use, but it's okay. So, but if someone starts saying, well, cocoa is, I don't like, it's not good for me, and I don't like chocolate, and I don't eat flour nor sugar, then I don't know, I want a pancake. And so then this cannot be called a chocolate cake any longer. It's different. And in that case, the adaptation was so extreme that it's no longer a cake. Now it's a pancake. So similar to what we will talk about now when we are talking about fidelity and adaptation. Even though we now have programs and practices and materials that, yes, they do include our Latino population, we still have a ways to go. And some of us have to balance that aspect of fidelity and adaptation when it comes to implementing our programs within our communities. Why? Because the resources of the materials don't exist in the language that we need it for our community, Latino community. Let's take a look at this. The fidelity of the program is simply, well, not simply, is how well does the implementation of this program coincide with what it promises and being effective, and with the original specifications. I'm going back to the chocolate cake example. If it has chocolate, if it has flour, and we change maybe one ingredient, we adapt it, the flour, but it's still a chocolate cake. What is fidelity in a program? It's the same as being a program. It's to adhere to the integrity of the program. Why is that important? Because when it comes to talking about evaluations or what we achieved with this program, it's not the same to say, okay, so I had a chocolate cake and I followed the instructions and the recipe, then saying, oh no, I made a lot of adaptations and it's no longer, if we change what we implement in the communities, it will affect the results. The adaptation, I'm going to jump forward. Adaptation refers to how and in which way a program, practice, or strategy has been modified to adjust to the local circumstances. In this case, to adjust it to our Latina communities. What is valid in terms of acceptable adaptations is, for example, changing the language to translate or modify the vocabulary. I'm in New Mexico. It's in the front. It's on the border. There's many people who live here in some of our communities who are from Mexico and Ciudad Juarez. And those of you who are in Puerto Rico, or Arizona or Ohio, and maybe the language that we're using here in New Mexico in comparison to yours is not the same, but it's okay. We are changing a language and it's an acceptable adaptation. The substitution of images to show families and youth something that looks like the objective public. If we are creating material in our Latino communities, does not see itself reflected in these practices, in the materials, in these examples, then you're not speaking to me as a Latina. So that's another acceptable adaptation. For example, in a curriculum that I had to implement, they had an activity that did not really go with our Latino community. And so instead of doing a poster, we changed it to something, doing something cultural. And so they made some blankets. That was a cultural thing with their families. And the concept was the same, but they identified more with creating a community blanket instead of that poster that the curriculum was asking for. Another acceptable adaptation is the substitution of cultural references, the modification of some aspects of the activities, for example, like physical contact. In our Latino communities, it's generally, and actually it's important, to say hello and to greet people and to have that time to maybe say hello, give each other a hug. Physical contact for some communities and cultures can be either offensive or can be well received. And so that's an example of an acceptable modification. The addition of relevant content and based on evidence to make the program more attractive to the participants. Maybe a presenter talks about the use of substances in their talks, and maybe bring someone from the community to highlight that subject. That could be an example of an adaptation that is acceptable. We're going to go a little more deeper, and there's a manual with much more information of what I am going to talk about here, but specifically it referring to the initiative, prevention initiatives and cultural values. In Familismo, again, this is through what we already know in our field of prevention. Somebody already did the work, did the research, helped us publish, so that those of us who are doing prevention, we can look at these, and now we can look at these articles as tools to use in our work. One of them is familismo. For example, the strong family ties in the family and the community, they form part of the identity and the support. Family in the Latino community is extended beyond parents and brothers and sisters. So it includes uncles, grandparents, cousins, maybe even close friends and godfathers and godmothers. And maybe in some communities, they have homes where they are multi-generational. And so we have to understand this, because if we are making an invitation to our program, well, invite the family. We have to keep in mind that the family is not just us, for us Latinos, it's not just a mother, father, and kid. It might be, I might invite other family members. Something else with that in mind, the things that we have to highlight when we are implementing our programs is that the family symbols, that is a way of, when we share our material, that we have include these family symbols, a family for familiar family living format, like, let's welcome to a presentation, we're going to have some drinks, somebody brought coffee and bread. The schedules that also should be adapted to what we know when it comes to the familismo, and surely language, and not just the translation, but also something that is related to the family. For example, instead of saying, come to our presentation of substance abuse in the family, oh, you could say, join us to have a family chat or have conversations within the family. So those slight modifications and adaptations can be more welcoming for our Latino community and help us have more support. And what follows is personalism, which what this means, I'm going to highlight only what's in black, that it shows sympathy, charisma, and kindness and personalism. And on my behalf, what I'm doing now today with my work is evaluations and as a workshop leader. And I know that in a workshop in Spanish, especially if I'm leading it in person, I am going to add about half an hour more, because first we arrive and then the coffee and then how are you and what's your name and where are you from, etc. So the conclusion, in fact, the sharing of questions, of stories and comments, and how we express our community in us Latinos, it will be different. It's a type of adaptation. And specifically, when it comes to other prevention programs, the format of the event I just mentioned in a Spanish workshop, I will add up to even half an hour or a few minutes more, because those personalisms are important. The opportunity of the activity that supports trust, maybe as a workshop leader, I'm introducing myself to everyone there, everyone participating, that there's an opportunity to share, be it me with the participants or amongst themselves, and especially if it's a small community, that, oh, I hadn't seen you in a while, oh, I hadn't seen you, neighbor, and so, et cetera, et cetera. So that opportunity to share. And so these are some of the things that we can highlight at the time of
focusing on the personalismo, making it personal. It's one of the important values. We continue. We continue with the being very respectful to cultural values. There's certain roles in our communities and families that are seen as leaders, maybe a priest, maybe a father or a teacher. These cultural values should be integrated into our prevention work. For example, the local professional could provide important contribution to prevention. Like we're talking the students that I was mentioning earlier. Maybe I'm talking to the parents now, or the I'm inviting the counselors and the teachers into this meeting because they have a certain role in the community, so that they can also receive the message and can forward the message to the parents of what's happening and help us achieve what we want in prevention. The prevention programs for certain members of the family exclusively, maybe we compose a group or conform a group of only the mothers or the grandmothers. In some communities, the role between the men and the women, the father and the mother, in order to be able to have talks in these prevention groups, maybe we have to meet with the mothers and the kids in the morning, and then we invite other members of the community in the afternoon. That's just as an example. And then you must have an anonymous opportunity to ask questions. So maybe there's some mixed relatives, the grandmother and the father are attending assist to the prevention program and meeting. Maybe you can provide a box so that they can write the questions and drop them, and they can feel that they're included and have that, trustworthiness, if you will, trust. And finally, the last cultural value that we're going to focus on in Latino communities is the religion and spirituality. And of course, traditional healing practices. This is a very spiritual concept. A lot of them are religious, but they're not, but they're very diverse ways in which they practice their religions. And they may help us to understand the mental health and the causes behind, if people believe in spirits or traditional figures, then how can we make sure the prevention program gets into their mindset? Maybe you can include the elders in the community, maybe a community healer or a shaman, if you will, maybe a leader within a community. They can talk and they can bring their thoughts about our practices of prevention or prevention programs, especially when we're talking about reaching for help and reducing the stigma in our communities. Then you should maybe consider that the people like the priests or the pastors or the leaders in the community, that you want to integrate them into the meetings, into the prevention program, or first responders. They're kind of like the first responders in our communities, because rather than going to a therapist, they go to the community leaders. That's what we mean when we talk about a varied collection of members in the coalition. Also, you got to consider the local schedules. It's not opportune to have a prevention program during a religious holiday or such. It's not going to work out in that community. If there's an event related to the religion of the community, you have to integrate the local traditional healing practices. It would be beneficial, and bring somebody from that segment or sector to explain what they do, and then work with a wider definition. That's why I presented or introduced the well-being definition, so that our community well-being is taken into account. Because when we're working with various different sectors of the community, if those values are present in that community, they're very deeply rooted. And that's where you can have that type of conversation that can complement our prevention programs. I'm going to make a pause because in relation to religion, respect, personalismo, and familismo, I would like to ask you, what kind of modifications or adaptations have you made in these areas? Familismo, spirituality, personalismo, and respect. Personalismo is like making it personal, and familismo is important to the family in the Latino communities. Can you talk about these values? Can you give me an example? If you can write it in the chat. Can you write an example of an adaptation that you've made? In spirituality, okay. Mindfulness, yoga, Reiki, okay. Those are just invitations. If you don't necessarily do it, those of you who are just starting to integrate yourselves into these prevention programs and how to best fulfill your role, then you might consider these values. Specifically, when we're talking about Latin communities. One of the things that I borrowed from another workshop in prevention ethics, and those of you who have been in this field for a while, prevention ethics is another field. It's one of the key workshops that you got to take in our preparation. Nothing about ourselves without ourselves. That's how we are defining these values and how to adapt the prevention programs in our communities. And with that, we will perform a very brief summary. We're reaching the end of our webinar. Just as we tried a little bit of the prevention concepts in our field, we're explaining the fundamental principles. First most, we make environmental prevention program, and we use the policies that we change in order to have an effect in later generations. When you integrate future generations, and you must commit to make them healthier. When I was talking about certain terms and vocabulary in prevention, make sure you take notes. Those of you who are getting academic preparation in prevention, these concepts are basic, are primordial, they're fundamental. The risk factors, the IOM, the Medical Institute, coalitions, sectors, all those keywords. We identify some values and opportunities only with just with the shared risk factors, for example, just to have a more ample definition, a wider definition that integrates the cultural strengths and how we can adapt these things. I'm going to return to the chat to see if there's any questions. We have reached the end of our workshop and webinar. There are two evaluations that we're asking you, as Paula mentioned. that you can fill out. Maybe if Paola or somebody else from the team. Greetings, yes. If anybody else wants to share something about these evaluations, I'm just gonna put up the link up on the screen, and then somebody can check the chat if there are some questions. There are no questions, no more questions in the chat. We sent the 2 links for the evaluations through the chat, and we recognize that the process might be a little tedious. Please fill out both of them, because it's important to receive the participation certification as well as the continuing ed credits. And we remind you that we will send you the participation certificate, assistance certification by email approximately in a week starting today. We also will be sending a PDF of today's presentations in the chat. We will post it in the chat for those of you who could not download it during the beginning of the presentation. And thank you very much, Christina, for all this information that you have brought to us today. It has been truly very pertinent, this topic that we have worked today. Thank you. Thank you for your participation, and don't forget the evaluations. They're very important to us, and I hope to see you again in another prevention activity, because our prevention world sometimes can be very small. We're going to remain some few seconds just in case somebody else has a commentary to make, and a couple more minutes so you can fill out the evaluation. And thank you to all. We're seeing the commentaries on the chat. Well, thank you so much. Today's presentation is finished. Thank you. Have a good afternoon.